Today on Harshaneeyam podcast, we are thrilled to speak with author Anne Morgan about her new book, Relearning to Read Adventures in Not Knowing. While many books about reading focus on comfort and coziness, Anne's latest work takes a refreshingly different approach. The book is built on the realization that if we want to truly read widely, we must first make friends with our own incomprehension. Anne argues that since no one can possibly be an expert in every literature from around the globe, we should embrace our limitations. By getting comfortable with discomfort, our own discomfort, she suggests we can actually deepen our appreciation for the world's richness. Anne Morgan is a talented writer and editor. Her first book, Reading the World Confessions of a Literary Explorer, was born from a massive personal challenge. In 2012, she embarked on a quest to read at least one book from every single country on earth. That project began as a simple blog but quickly grew into something much more profound. Through this journey, Anne connected with readers, writers, translators, and literary organizations across the entire planet. She personally experienced the transformative power of literature during this time. She learned firsthand how stories have the potential to bridge cultural, political, and religious divides. Even today, Anne continues to share her passion for international literature at www.ayearofreadingtheworld.com. Her unique literary journey has even featured in a TED Talk, inspiring many others to start their own ventures. Beyond her writing, Anne currently sits on the funding panel for English Pen's Pen Translate program. She has also helped curate long lists for several major literary prizes over the years. Anne is also a frequent speaker on the topic of international literature, both within the UK and abroad. She is a familiar face at numerous literary festivals around the world. We are honored to host her today to discuss her adventurous approach to reading. Now, Anne, you have spoken about how our education often treats reading as a test of intelligence. And in your journey towards what you call the adventure of not knowing, very interesting adventure of not knowing, how did you physically and mentally practice letting go of that need to be the clever reader? That's the first question.
Thank you for that question. Yes, well, this all came about from my quest to open up my reading, which had been until 2012 had been very Anglo-centric. I'm British and I live in the UK, and it was really a chance comment that made me realise that until I was nearly 30, my reading had almost always been books written originally in English. And that didn't make much sense to me. So I decided to spend 2012 trying to read a book from every country in the world. And that's what I did. And that included many challenges, many practical challenges, fitting all that reading into my life, finding works translated from every country, deciding what a country is, which not everyone agrees on, as we know if we watch the news. But underneath all that, there was a more profound challenge, which was that I realized the way that I had learnt to read, or what I expected reading wasn't going to work when I was trying to read internationally. Because I realized that my education had taught me to read by being clever about books, by trying to understand everything, by getting the right answer. And I was very proud of being good at reading. I was a good student at English literature. It was my favourite subject, and I studied it at university. And I was really proud of saying clever things about books and getting good marks in my exams. But what that relied on was bringing a lot of contextual knowledge to the books I read. So unpacking the similes and the metaphors in the things I read by knowing about the context behind them, by knowing that in Shakespeare's day, corn was threshed in a certain way. And so this means that this metaphor has this resonance, but might also illustrate that the character is feeling sad or worried about money, all these different things that you can pull out. And that's really enriching and really rewarding and exciting, and it can be really fun to do as a student. But the problem is, if you are reading internationally, regardless of how many languages you speak or how many countries you've been to, there'll come a point where you don't understand something, or where you can't be certain about the context. You can't be certain about whether something is a joke or whether something that a character is doing is a strange thing in their society or just the standard thing for a person that age in that situation to do. You can't be certain. And because I was doing this eccentric project where I was trying to read all these books so quickly in a year, in the end, it was 197 books that I read and blogged about in 1 year. And I had people all around the world who'd got interested in the project and were following it. So I felt very responsible because I knew there were lots of people who were following this project. Many of them were helping me. They were suggesting things I should read. They were sometimes sending me books, even in one case translating a book for me. A group of people translated a whole book.
Wonderful.
I know. It was quite an adventure, yeah. But so I felt really responsible to write carefully and thoughtfully about each of the books that I read. But I suddenly realized that maybe I wasn't going to know what I was talking about. I might sound really stupid. I might get lots of things wrong. So I realized the only way that I could deal with that, the only way that I could honor this project was by being honest about my limitations, being honest about the fact that there were going to be lots of things I couldn't be sure about, being open to being corrected, being open to changing my views or to learning more, but also sometimes being comfortable with not understanding and perhaps with never understanding everything. Being comfortable with the fact that not everything can be Googled, not everything can be researched. Some questions may never be fully answered. And that may be to do with my conditioning, my perspective on the world, or it may be in certain cases that the story isn't intended to be fully understood in the way that I might think reading is supposed to work. So that was how I started. But it was a bit like learning a new kind of exercise or a new sort of physical discipline, in that it was a bit like a muscle that I had to train. It was very uncomfortable, and it still is uncomfortable at times. But I had to get more and more used to that uncertainty, that wobbly feeling of, oh gosh, I don't know what is going on here, and spending time with that, thinking about that, and seeing what that taught me about myself and about my conditioning, my reading historically.
So you mean to say, by embracing things that you don't understand and accepting that you don't understand, you say that it made you a better person or a better reader, or both?
I think both. I'd like to think both. I can't really comment on whether I'm a better person, but I think I probably am a better reader, in that, but I'm also a better reader of myself. I think this is an interesting thing. We learn by taking this approach. I learned to pay more attention to my own biases, my own conditioning, the assumptions that I make, and that I often probably didn't realize I was making. Now, none of us is entirely self-aware. None of us can step outside our own heads
Correct.
and see ourselves entirely. But I think we can become more self-aware, more conscious, more mindful of the patterns that we follow, of the habits that we have. And when you start to pay attention to, I think often, certainly in the educational tradition that I was raised in, the idea of not knowing the right answer would often feel like a shameful thing. It would be, that would feel like a failing or a fault, something to be embarrassed about. And so I think many people, myself included, when we don't understand something, we may often hide this from ourselves by getting irritated, by telling ourselves there's something wrong with this book, this is badly written, or it's not for me. The problem is with the book, it's not with me. And actually starting to learn that when I feel that flash of irritation, well, maybe sometimes it might be a badly written book, but maybe more often it might be that there's something in me that is struggling, that is maybe threatened by what I'm reading, or is challenged by it, that it's not behaving as I expect it to. And that's interesting. And asking yourself, why does that bother me so much? Why am I feeling irritated by that? Why should this character behaving in this way be problematic for me? That's interesting when you start to pay attention to that, and to unpick what might it be in my background, my education, that has made me find this difficult.
No, not understanding a book based on your background, your culture, and not able to enjoy reading that particular book. How do you differentiate? Because sometimes, as you said, some things which we don't understand, we don't enjoy, right? So, how do you are able to differentiate it now clearly?
I think it can be. It requires energy to sit with not knowing. It
Absolutely.
requires effort, and I would certainly say there are times when I seek comfort, as I'm sure we all do. I seek familiarity.
Correct. It happens to me even in the books that I read in my own mother tongue, Telugu.
Hmm.
That's the reason I asked it. It can happen not only with literature in translation, or you might know a language other than your mother tongue and you are reading it, or like you said, completely in literature in translation where you are reading books from a totally different culture.
Yes, I think that's really important, and I mean, I'm an English speaker. English is one of the most diverse languages in
Correct.
that there are many Englishes,
Correct. There are
and
many English.
actually,
Even within the UK, I gather.
even within the UK, absolutely there are. And, the sort of English that I speak, once upon a time, was considered, it was called received pronunciation, which to me sounds a very kind of lofty term, which seems to imply that this way of speaking was given down by the gods or something.
Okay.
Nowadays, actually, the way that I speak, most people who speak English around the world don't speak English like me. There are far more speakers of Indian English than there are of British English. So really, if we're talking about ownership, well, I'm in the minority in English speakers, and I think that's really interesting because it's we don't have the same idea of hierarchy about good and bad Englishes. It's different Englishes. I mean, there's some of those old prejudices still
Yeah,
exist, but
they do exist. Yes.
um, there are. It's a much richer. But it means that there are many stories written in English that may be quite unfamiliar to me in terms of the way they use the language, in terms of the world that they inhabit. So it's definitely not just a case of translated literature. And even something that's written in a very familiar style to me may present challenges. And I think the truth is, this is not to say that no book is bad. There are badly written books.
Yes. Yes.
I'm sure you, as a wide reader, know this as well. And sometimes when we feel that irritation, it is well placed because something isn't good. It's not true. It's not working well as a story. But what I think is the case when I read something, particularly when I'm reading something that I'm aware comes from a tradition that is unfamiliar to me or less familiar to me, is that I should be more conscious that when that flash of irritation occurs, there's a higher chance that it says something about me than about the book, and I should be less quick to jump to a judgment that I might make if I were reading something from a more familiar world. And I think it's really interesting as well because part of that irritation comes from when you are not the reader that the writer expects. So every writer writes for an imagined reader. Some writers almost write for themselves or a reader who is like themselves. And in my book, Relearning to Read, I sort of play with that idea a little bit and talk about writing for a reader who's like me and imagining what that person will think of what I'm writing. Some writers, maybe depending on the political situation in which they're writing or depending on, their society, may write for a particular class of person, a particular people with particular views. But there will be an expected reader. And when you're not the reader that was expected, you don't quite fit. And there's a gap between what you're expected to know or what you're expected to assume and what you actually know. And so that's an interesting experience when you find yourself being a bit of a distance away. It's a bit sometimes like eavesdropping on a conversation. And you hear things that you might never have heard if you were actually in the room, because that person wouldn't have talked in quite that way. Or they may not have said, particularly I have to say as a British reader, with the colonial history, the British Empire is certainly not viewed in warm terms in many places, and there are many stories not written for British readers that write in ways that perhaps if they were writing for a British audience, they wouldn't quite be written that way. And that's fascinating for me to read that, and was really eye-opening for me as someone educated in a country where, to be honest, empire wasn't really discussed, or if it was discussed, it was discussed in broadly positive terms as a civilizing influence that brought the railways. And, think atrocities like the Amritsar massacre, the Bengal famine, the torture of the Mau Mau were never mentioned, So
Absolutely.
For me as a British reader, reading books not written for me and eavesdropping on conversations that discuss these things, that was a huge education for me, and a very uncomfortable one at times. But I think it has made me a better reader.
You talked about embracing things which you don't understand and trying to understand what they are. And you developed this fascinating concept called incomprehension workshops. Please tell us more about it.
Of course. Well, when I was at school, one of the things that was very common in English literature classes, and I think in many classes around the world, many students I've met in different countries have done similar exercises, was the comprehension exercise. And the way this worked was you would be given an extract of text, usually a paragraph, and you'd be asked questions about it. What does this word mean? Rewrite this sentence in other words, explain what's going on here. And of course, that demonstrated very useful things about how the student was engaging with the text and how much they understood of the text. But the problem with it, I found, was that it carried the implication that there was one right way of reading something, and that if you couldn't explain everything in a text, you were failing. Now, as we've discussed, when you read internationally, whoever you are, you cannot be certain that you will understand everything. And so what I decided to do was to play with this and turn that idea upside down. And so the incomprehension workshop, I usually have about 30 people taking part, and we have 5 or 6 extracts of text that are going to be from books that are outside the comfort zone of the people in the room.
Could you please be more specific? Can you give an example outside the...
Sure. So for example, some of the pieces of text that I often do are extracts from, there's a book from the Federated States of Micronesia, which is a book written by a man called Llewellyn Bernhardt. It's one of the few books ever written by a resident of that country, and it brings together myths and history and personal recollections, and it's quite a magical story, which many people struggle to read as literal fact, but Llewellyn Bernhardt may have intended it to be literally factual. We've done texts from North Korea before. We've done translations of text of Griot's performances in West Africa, things that are going to be probably the readers will never have read anything quite like that before. But crucially, I don't tell them any information.
So there is no introduction, nothing.
There's no introduction. So all they get is the text, the chunk of text. They don't know who wrote it, where it's from. I mean, that is a problematic concept. What makes a book from somewhere anyway? When you start to think about that, that falls apart. But they don't know when it was published or who translated it, if it is translated. So all they have is the extract of text. And rather than answering questions, they have to ask questions about it. So what does this mean? Why does this happen? I don't understand this. I'd like to know more about this. Oh, this, I find this slightly upsetting, or this offends me, or this surprises me. And then by discussing these things and paying attention to them, we start to learn the things that we reach for as readers when we don't understand. Because one of the really interesting things about reading is that it's a collaborative process, as you will know very well, Anil. One of the things that makes reading so satisfying is it's an active thing. you work with the writer to build the world. So a good writer will leave lots of gaps in their writing. We might think that a description is full of details, but actually, when you count them, there are usually not that many details, and there are many gaps which we will fill in with our own imagination.
So more of a participative kind of.
Exactly. And when you're reading a book from a very familiar background to yours, a very similar background to yours, you will fill those gaps with things that probably are broadly what the writer envisaged, what they imagined. And you'll build a world that is roughly what the writer had in mind themselves. When you're reading a story that comes from a very unfamiliar tradition, you may plug those gaps with all sorts of things that don't fit and that actually say more about you than about that world. And all of us have things that we default to if we don't understand, things that we reach for. It will be something in your frame of reference. So I might reach for biblical references or British history or folk music. You might reach for family history or stories in your past or music that you love, or, you know, any kind of traditions, any cultural things that are close to you. And it's really interesting to see people starting to realize, oh, when I don't understand something, I tend to reach for this, or this is my default. And all of us will default to slightly different things, and all of us will make slightly different assumptions. Some people, if they are reading a text where there's an unnamed protagonist, will automatically assume that is a man. Some will automatically assume it's a woman. You know, and suddenly discovering this about yourself, that's interesting. You know, why did I think that? What made me think that? Maybe sometimes there's something in the text that suggests that, or maybe it's what our brain superimposes. So it goes back to what I was saying about learning to read yourself better. In these workshops, really, that's what people, I hope, come away with a better idea of how they read. And the way that each of us reads is slightly different. So that's what makes it exciting.
Now, what is the best feedback that you have received?
Well, oh gosh, there have been lots. I mean, one of the lovely things about it is it's been, I've run the workshop all over the world and with people of all ages.
Is it online workshop?
I have done some online sessions, and I do them occasionally. I think generally it works best in person, although there have been some really good online sessions. Well, there was one lovely session where I was looking at the idea of what is truth, and I got people to define in advance what they thought truth was. And there were this was in the UK, this particular session, a lot of very Western scientific objective definitions of truth, and it had to be evidence-based, it had to be provable. And there was one man in the room in particular who was a mathematician, and he was very kind of logic-based and facts-based, and, you know. And then we did the session, and at the end he said, I've realized that Western science is just one prism that I look through, and I have to learn to look through other prisms in order to really appreciate all the stories in the world. And I thought that was a great thing.
Coming from a mathematician who might have spent all his life.
Well, indeed. But I did a lovely workshop in Assam, actually, a few years ago at Dibrugarh University at the literary festival there. And there were students who were so excited and so lit up by the workshop and the chance to play and to explore. And I had some wonderful feedback from them saying that it had really changed their thinking, changed how they thought about books and what was possible. So it was a really, really exciting. And for me, that was particularly exciting because it was the first time that I had done the session with a group of readers who had been educated in a very different system. And so I didn't know how they would respond. I've done the workshop with online with people from all over the world, but this was the first time I was taking it to an education institution in a very different place to where I grew up. And so it was wonderful to see these students so sparky, so kind of so creative, so full of enthusiasm. And that's been a real joy.
Wonderful. Now we will come to your book, the recent one which just come out last year, end of the last year. That is Relearning to Read, Adventures in Not Knowing. And in that book, you have spoken, you cite Walter Ong's idea that all reading is a form of internalized listening. And you also spent, in the book, you mentioned that you also spent a lot of your youth listening to audiobooks while knitting. So, how does listening to a book differently affect your ability as compared to the visual act of reading? Because these days you see a lot of audiobooks coming in.
Yeah, I mean, I still do listen to a fair number of audiobooks, although I find these days that I need to listen to certain types of books. I can't listen to literary fiction. I tend not to focus as well when I'm listening, because usually I'm doing something else. So I might be exercising or doing chores or whatever. So I tend to listen to non-fiction and relatively light plot-driven things if I'm listening now. But I think what I meant in that context was that listening requires you to be more instinctual in your responses. The kind of reading that I had learnt to do and had fallen into the habit of doing was a very intellectual kind of reading, a very self-conscious kind of reading, one that drew on knowledge and interpretation and kind of processing, mental processing. And I think it got in the way of that very instinctive response that actually, if we sit back and trust ourselves a little more, sometimes is there if you listen, if you pay attention. And the thing about listening as well is that you don't stop the story continues. So there isn't time to second guess yourself. You are just following along, just responding. Like when we're having this conversation now, there isn't time to analyze everything. It's just we respond in the way that feels natural in the moment. And so, and I'm a big believer in deep reading. I'm a big believer in reading things several times to really think carefully about them. That's a wonderful practice. And as a translator, I'm sure you do this a great deal. But sometimes stripping away that over intellectualization, that kind of those barriers that I think can stop us paying attention to those instinctive responses is helpful, and particularly when it's a book that we can't be clever about because we can't know the context, we can't know the things that we would use to analyze the tools. We don't have those tools. Actually, those instinctive responses are really important. So that's why listening, I think, is a useful way of thinking about reading sometimes.
So, in a sense, are you saying that things that we don't understand in the books, they force us to think more about it, and probably in the end we will understand more about the culture and the book? That's what you're indicating.
Maybe sometimes. I mean, there are many things that we may not understand, that we may never understand. I think what it requires is a certain humility, and I think the listening that I talk about in my book, in addition to the audiobooks, I spent some time volunteering on a helpline in my early 20s, and there were many people in emotional crisis phoning up.
You mentioned about it in the book in detail. Yes,
exactly. And many of those stories were troubling and unsettling and worrying and sad for many reasons. But many of them were really hard to understand because I was coming into someone's life in the middle of a crisis. They obviously weren't there to explain themselves. They just needed to offload. And so they wouldn't necessarily tell me all the context. They would just say what they wanted to say. And I would have to go on instinct. I would have to make peace with the gaps, with the things that didn't make sense. And sometimes paying attention to those or finding the questions that were buried in what people were saying was the way to open up the conversation, was the way to show my concern and my care for them, but also to encourage them to look at the things that were troubling them, occasionally from different perspectives as well. So that was a case of listening for the things that didn't necessarily make sense to me, and then sometimes those things proved to be the keys to a greater connection, a greater understanding in the conversation.
I'm digressing a lot from the questions that I have sent you, but anyway, let me go ahead and ask you about the helpline. Do you think your experience, the helpline, listening to stories of the people, uh, do you think that made you a more involved reader now?
I think it's made me a more humble reader, and I think humility is a big part of this. Being aware of your own limitations, because that goes hand in hand with being prepared to admit that you don't understand. It's being aware that maybe because of my background, because of the things that I've been taught to assume, I'm not able to understand this person's perspective, or I don't have knowledge of this, or I need to actually sit back and reserve my judgment and allow that voice to speak, without rushing to make sense of it. So I think the seeds of that were in that experience, which was very different to the educational experience I had, which was about making sense of things and about making judgments about things, I suppose, and being definitive in my opinions. And so, yes, it was about humility, really.
In chapter 2, you mentioned about your experience of reading Iraqi novel, the Shalash and the Iraqi. The book you confessed all that you almost gave up on because you felt it's really exhausting. Please tell us about that experience and what it taught you. Really.
Yeah, so Shalash the Iraqi is a really interesting text. It's by an author who goes by the pseudonym Shalash the Iraqi. No one knows who they are. It's assumed to be a man, but it may not be. But this was a book that was compiled from a series of blogs written in Iraq in the mid-2000s, after the fall of Saddam Hussein, when the society was crumbling in many respects. There was a lot of sectarian violence. The US troops had arrived to try and fill the power vacuum, and there was a great deal of uncertainty. And these blogs were a very kind of a wide-ranging selection of texts that were circulated at the time online, but also printed out and shared secretly between readers in Baghdad and the wider community. And they were compiled and put together in this English translation by Luke Leifgren, which sort of brings the books into a book form, brings the texts into a book form. And for a reader like me, not knowing much about early 21st century Iraq, not having been to Iraq, it was a very challenging read. There were many references that weren't clear to me. And it was interesting to read the translator's comments himself, because he had originally thought that he would do lots of footnotes and that everything would be explained. And he, in the end, decided not to do that because there would be so many of them, and he felt it would be a barrier to the reader engaging with the text, and that they could Google, they could look things up if they needed to. And I think it was a wise decision, but actually it meant that you had to let go. I had to let go of trying to be certain about much. And there were some things that I did recognize very much, but there were other pieces that were very, very hard for me to make any kind of sense of. And it felt very slippery to me. It felt as though there was no foothold or fingerhold for me to grab onto. But I think also when I stepped back a little bit and thought about it, I realized that there may be some deeper reasons why my reading was challenged with that text, because coming back to this idea of not being the reader that is expected, as an English speaker, closely allied, more closely allied with the invading forces, who in the texts are actually the biggest enemy. I mean, the writer is no fan of Saddam Hussein, nor is he a fan, nor are they a fan of many of the people struggling for power in the region. But the worst enemies in the eyes of the narrator are the invaders. And so as someone who was part, our culture was part of that invasion. And I grew up around that time. I was a student in my late teens, early 20s. Our media was flooded with stories about Iraq and certain assumptions about Iraq. And this war was being sort of talked about in quite sort of triumphalist terms. And as we now know, there were quite a few lies being told about it. That obviously is going to have affected my thinking, my understanding, my reading, and perhaps something in me, something that I struggle to access, may be blocking my ability to engage with the text on certain levels, because the war may have damaged my own head as well. There may be war damage in my mind because of that. So I think that's an interesting it's an interesting thing to reflect on. It can often feel, when we see these terrible things happening around the world, that we are distanced from them. There's a strange kind of gap there, but aloofness, exactly, it's a good word, aloofness. But actually, these things damage all of us. And depending on the cultural perspective that we come from, there may be particular weights, particular responsibilities there that we need to think about and need to understand may have affected the way that we engage with certain stories or certain voices.
Reading is also a journey, kind of a journey. People are at different stages of their, irrespective of the stage that they are in their reading journey. If you have to advise 3 do's and 3 do nots, 3 don'ts, what would they be? 3 each, please.
Wow. Okay, 3 do's and 3 don'ts. Okay. Well, I think it's important to follow your inclinations. So if you are interested in a particular kind of story, use that as a guide rope to take you further. So if you like romances, well, why not go and read South American romances, or find out what love stories are like in polygamous societies, or love stories in China, or if you like crime fiction, why not go and see what crime fiction's like around the world? Use your inclinations as a guide rope. That's one of them, I would say. Okay, I've got 2 more do's. Do be open to trying things. So I think perhaps it's kind of a bit like what I said earlier about reserving judgment a bit longer if you're reading something that is from an unfamiliar tradition. Do give it a little bit more time, and do be ready to push through some initial sort of challenges or irritations or frustrations. But also, number 3, if finding time to read is challenging, as it is for many of us, then maybe create a window of time, carve out some time where you tell yourself, whether it's half an hour at the end of the day, or half an hour on your lunch break, or waking up half an hour earlier to read, or time on a Saturday, or whatever it is. Find a regular thing. It doesn't have to be hours and hours and hours, but it's the regular habit. And a bit like a muscle, it grows. I think the more you focus on it, the more you are able to do it. So do carve out time. So those are my do's. Don't make yourself miserable by forcing yourself to read something you absolutely hate. Life's too short. There are many, many wonderful books out there. So while I would say be prepared to...
what is your tolerance limit for a novel? Is it 20 pages or 25 pages or 30 pages?
Oh, that depends. And of course, if I've got to read something for a particular reason, then that's a different thing, isn't it? I think it depends. And again, that boundary will probably be bigger for something that I'm aware I don't know. So yeah, I think it depends. But I would say life's too short to make yourself miserable with a book. There are plenty of other things that can make you miserable. So just because you feel like you should read something, you don't have to. If you're not enjoying it, stop and go and read something else. If it's making you unhappy, it's not worth it. So that's one don't. Don't be threatened by other people's choices or comments. If you like something that someone else doesn't like, that's fine. And similarly, if you don't like something that everyone says is brilliant, that's also fine. And that might be interesting. And it might say some interesting things about you, or it might say some interesting things about the people around you. So don't be threatened by other people's opinions. And I would also say, and this is maybe a slightly controversial one, I would say don't read introductions and surrounding text before you read the main.
That's interesting one. Yes, yeah.
I would say read it for yourself first, and then read critical things if you want to. And many introductions are wonderful and really illuminating, but they can put a filter over your reading.
How you are supposed to read.
Exactly. And it may be very wise, and there may be, but it may be very useful and illuminating, but yeah, exactly. It imposes a framework, which actually I think is more important to build your own relationship with a book first, and then come to the introduction, come to the critics afterwards.
The book ends with the story of, I hope I am pronouncing this right, embracing things which I don't pronounce properly.
Very good.
So, Michael Kopomasi.
Yes, Tete Michel Pomasi. Very good. Yeah.
Tete Michel Kopomasi. Okay. He's a young man from Togo. And interestingly, he falls in love with the book about Greenland. And he goes ahead and he spends 8 years traveling just to experience that unknown for himself. This is one of the wonderful, anecdotes from the book. And in the same way, you argue that you don't need to be a be all and know all to have a meaningful encounter with the book. In your opinion, what is the internal and physical experience of such a shift in reader's perspective?
Well, one of the reasons that I love Tete Michel's journey and his work, his book, and actually one of the reasons why I was really thrilled finally last summer to go to Greenland with him myself. We travelled together through Greenland. He was 84 then, and we went back to many of the places that he first visited 60 years ago. One of the reasons that I love his work is the way that he is curious. I think that there are two kinds of curiosity broadly. There's good curiosity, as I call it, and bad curiosity. Bad curiosity is a kind of voyeurism, a superior sort of anthropological approach to other people, other cultures, other people's stories, which treats them as interesting artifacts to be studied, that might enrich our knowledge, that might kind of shore up our reputation, that might give us clever things to say. Whereas good curiosity, it's quite extractivist, essentially, that bad curiosity. Good curiosity is about being ready to be changed by what you learn. It's about exchange. It's about sharing your own humanity. And this is something that Tete Michel Pomasi exemplifies. What he did when he went to live with the Inuit in the 1960s was he was very humble. He took on board their culture and he shared his own stories, and he was ready to learn and to develop and grow and to build meaningful relationships with the people that he spent time with. He talked to me quite a bit about a French ethnologist that he met in Greenland who had come to study the Inuit while he was there. And he spent time helping him build his hut. And this man arrived with crates and crates and crates of tinned food. And the whole year he just ate his European food and went out and kind of made notes and then came back to his hut. And whereas Tete Michel lived with the Inuit, he lived in their houses, he slept on their sleeping platforms, he hunted with them, he ate their food, even when he struggled to appreciate it, but he got to like it. And that for me is the difference. It's that willingness to engage on an equal footing, to celebrate the humanity in one another with openness and curiosity and joy, and a readiness to be changed. And so I think that's the difference. It's about change. I mean, this is a transformative thing, and I'm constantly, and I hope I will always be, and to be honest, the most interesting people I've encountered throughout the world are people who are willing to continue changing and continue growing and continue reassessing, learning, who are not fixed in their opinions about things necessarily, but willing to bend, to move, and to grow. And that's what I think this not knowing encourages. I hope it does anyway. Is a readiness to have your mind changed at times.